Chasen Cunitz works at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and is a self-proclaimed EPA super geek, and he's excited to spread the message. Chasen has to be one of the most fascinating earthlings you'll hear on the show this season. After working as a petrochemical corporate attorney in Alaska, Chasen left to get lost in the Alaska wilderness, where he spent 8 years living in remote villages and working with First Nation communities. In recent years, he started working for the EPA, an organization he's been infatuated with since he was a youngling.
Now, we know what you're wondering. Why have someone from the EPA on this season? Well, we wanted to ask the question of how the EPA can work with for-profit companies, or does the EPA even want to work with for-profit companies? We met Chasen, and he also wanted to come on and bring some of his personal views on the effects of climate change in places he's lived, like Alaska. So we'll learn all that and a few other things, like how the EPA started, what impact they've had over the last 50 years, and that catching a crab may not mean what you think. Little disclaimer, Chasen came to give his personal views on our climate problems, not as a representative of the EPA in any official standing. But I know you're still going to learn a ton, and he provides a really cool picture and connection to for-profit companies. So stick with us, enjoy, Mayhem on.
Mayhem on! Chasen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, Jacob. Great to be here.
We're really pumped to have you on the show. We have gotten a bunch of companies, and we thought having someone who has spent a lot of time in Alaska, who has worked for the EPA, which has been in some way a really pivotal force, right, in the past 50 years in the U.S. since President Nixon created the agency. It's an agency, right?
It is, yeah. It's an executive agency. Not a lot of people know that it was founded by Nixon, actually, who is a Republican. So, yeah, in 1970, he started this whole thing up, and it's actually pretty fascinating how that came about. But we can talk about that after the intro, I guess.
Wonderful. Chasen, what does catching a crab mean? It's a saying that I found online. I thought you might be familiar with.
Yeah, so for your listeners' benefit, I'm a rower and a rowing coach here in Seattle, and catching a crab is probably one of the worst things that any rower can experience in the boat. Basically, when you're rowing, your oar goes from vertical to horizontal. It's called being on the square versus being on the feather. And the momentum of the boat is just a tremendous thing. It's a force to be reckoned with, and each time you take a stroke, if you envision like a bike wheel, it's like you're tapping a spinning bike wheel along. You're not grabbing it and thrusting it forward. You're just really giving it more momentum, but it's already got a significant amount of momentum. So basically, catching a crab is when you fail to get your oar horizontal to the water in time with the rest of the boat. So everybody else has gotten their oar out of the water, but your oar is still stuck there in that vertical position. And the force of the boat as it drives that oar through the water basically lands full on your chest. And yeah, and it's broken ribs, sternums, collarbones. Yeah. In the worst case scenarios, it has literally jettisoned people out of the boat. That's what we call an ejector crab.
My God.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a whiplash by the
it's ridiculous. So, and if you're rowing along at 34, sometimes 40 strokes a minute, it's very fast, and so it can happen in the blink of an eye, and the next thing you know, you're in the drink. So that is catching a crab. Yeah.
How fast in a competitive race does a rowing boat go, either in knots or miles per hour or kilometers
some of
per
the
hour?
fastest boats will get up to like 25 miles an hour.
Oh my goodness.
That's a very high level of performance, like your Olympic caliber 8-man shells. Yeah.
How about the ones that you are involved in? Is it more like 20, 15, or what?
Nowhere near as fast.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. There's a position within the rowing boat, the team. It's called the coxswain.
Yeah, the coxswain. You got it right.
Yeah. What's the purpose of the coxswain?
I would argue that the coxswain, who fills a function in man boats or 8-woman boats or 4-person boats. And they are steering, they're making the calls about when we're going to pick up the rate, when we're going to apply more power, any technical improvements that we need. They're really like the captain or the coach in the boat. But their biggest concern is safety, making sure that we're not hitting
Hmm.
anything, not hitting other boats.
Mm.
It's a pivotal role, and I would argue easily the most important in any boat. Um,
Hmm.
Opinions on this vary, but
Okay.
that's my call. Yeah.
Nice.
What are the other opinions?
Oh, I think rowers can sometimes have very strong opinions, and I think some of the best rowers I've met have been very humble, and so I aspire to that humility. So other
Nice.
rowers might not necessarily think that coxswains are that important, but I would disagree.
Is the coxswain a pretty tall person?
No,
Small.
they tend to be very small. Yeah,
Okay.
we want to have as little drag on that boat as possible, and so that means that we obsess with we call it um, power per pound is what some coaches call it.
Oh, wow.
Others
Yeah.
call it like power to weight ratio. But
Uh-huh.
you want your coxswain to be as small as possible, and
Ah.
that's kind of one of the opinions of rowers is that coxswains are just dead weight, which I don't agree with whatsoever. I think they very much
Got
demonstrate
it.
their value.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yep. Yep.
generally they're very small humans.
Yep.
And a coxswain at
Sure.
the very front. They're not rowing, right? So they're not adding power units
Yep.
to the boat. Okay.
But they are facing the direction that the boat is going, and that's pretty
Oh,
critical.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
What
Everyone else is facing the opposite way, right?
yeah. We're all going backwards, man.
do they have a microphone?
They do, yeah. They have a microphone, and they have anywhere from 4 to 2 speakers throughout the boat so that we can hear them. Um,
Ah.
yeah, some of the best boats I've been in are tremendously loud because as you're doing the squaring, feathering action that I mentioned earlier, you're actually creating kind of a knocking sound, and it's
Uh-huh.
really cool. It's like you're being in the middle of a drum circle. And
Wow.
one of my favorite coaches described rowing not so much as boating as just a collective percussion experience, and you were just
Hmm.
all trying to drum in the same time with one another.
Hmm.
So it can get pretty
That's
loud.
cool. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's cool.
yeah.
It seems like there needs to be some modern movie that comes out about rowing and the rowing culture. Because I know there
I,
was a movie that came out in the '80s with Rob Lowe,
mm-hmm.
and he's a rower at like it's a Ivy League school, and he like he shows up, he sucks, and then he gets really good, and then something
Yeah.
happens, and like we need something like that now.
They just kicked out a movie called The Novice, which is sort of like a horror film. It's a bit like a thriller. It's about this
Interesting.
girl. Yeah, it's about this girl that picks up rowing, and she pretty quickly kind of like loses her mind about it, which isn't
Oh,
far from the
wow.
truth. Yeah, but it
Because of like
enters
her obsession of it or something?
exactly. Yeah,
Got
and
it.
just like
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
her overbearing like drive to succeed. But we do
Oh,
actually have
okay.
an amazing feature film coming out, produced by George Clooney of all people.
Oh,
Uh,
whoa.
yeah, it's an adaptation of the book Boys in the Boat, which was a national bestseller and actually based here in Seattle for some of it. And it's about the University of Washington men's rowing team that went across to Germany during those Olympics and basically super underdog story, but they trounced Hitler's German boat, who were predicted to win.
Wow.
And these were just like the sons of fishermen and loggers from
Huh.
pioneer days, Washington. And
Wow.
it's a really really amazing tale. And a lot of rowers call it the holy grail of books
Okay.
in our culture. Yeah. So
Love
George
it.
Clooney's I think wrapped up principal photography on that, and we'll be doing post pro here for a release next year sometime.
Shit,
Cool.
I can't wait to
Yeah.
see that movie.
I know. That's
Yeah, me
cool.
too. Yeah.
I think I've heard about the documentary that because like there was a documentary
Yeah.
recently or a few
Yep.
years ago, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
PBS did that. Yeah, it was pretty good.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
University of Washington. That's where I went.
Nice.
Chasen, did you didn't go to UW, right?
I did not know. I rode briefly for the Huskies of the East at Northeastern University in Boston.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that where you got your JD?
No, I went to Willamette University down in Oregon.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
Coincidentally, actually, rowing had a part to play in that. They had an undergrad rowing team, and I was privileged enough to coach there while I went to law school. So I got to help out with that
Nice.
program. Yeah, yeah, it was awesome.
And how did you end up becoming a lawyer? Why did you end up becoming a lawyer?
Yeah, so I was on the debate team in high school and college. And so I've always had kind of an analytical mind around arguments and later policy when I got into policy debate. Um, and then after college, I graduated with a degree in finance and I went to work as an auditor. Really enjoyed it. I found kind of the problem solving and investigatory aspects of auditing to just be
Hmm.
fascinating. Um, and ultimately, I ended up working for some attorneys. And just the way that their minds worked, I found riveting. I loved how everything was a puzzle that needed to be solved.
Hmm.
There was no complexity that was insurmountable. They were also a very collaborative group, which unfortunately not a lot of lawyers fit that camp. But they convinced me that I should try for the LSAT, and I
Wow.
did. I did terribly, so I studied a little bit more, um, and uh, and then I did okay enough to get accepted to some schools. And as I
Nice.
mentioned, Willamette had a rowing team, and it just felt like a great vibe. It's a smaller school, definitely a better professor to student ratio, and that's kind of what I was looking for. I wanted something where I could just feel the good vibes and catch that passion from my instructors.
Okay. And you're originally from Michigan.
I am, yeah.
How'd you end up over?
Yeah, I was
Why Oregon? Yeah.
Yeah, I was born in LA and actually
Oh,
moved to Michigan, yeah, kind of early in my childhood and went to high school in Michigan, which is where I found rowing. But during my rowing career, I had the opportunity to race in the Pacific Northwest, and I was just enamored from
mm,
moment one. I
Mm.
also dated a girl that had family in Seattle, so we came out to visit when I was younger, and just great formulative memories of the mountains, kind of meeting the ocean. It's a
Hmm.
unique place here in the Pacific Northwest. I'm
I love
glad I
that.
found it. Yeah.
a second that. Ty's actually from California. He's
Oh,
Yeah.
neat.
from
Yeah.
like,
And I came here for a very similar reason. Like
mm,
just where the mountains meet the ocean was just exactly what I got enamored by too. So yeah, absolutely love it.
Yeah. It's a stunning place to be. I feel so fortunate.
Agreed.
you see, I was born here, so I immediately took it for granted. And it wasn't until I got like, I got stoned one day, and I was like, someone was driving us to a concert, and I looked on, we were like going over, I think it was West Seattle, and I looked on the horizon, and I was just like, oh my God, there's such beauty here. Like it took me over 20 years to
Right.
acknowledge it and get it. And then since then it's been like a new beginning. Like I'm not kidding. And as cheesy as that all sounds,
Nice.
I appreciate that. That's cool.
Jason, what got you interested in climate sustainability space? So I imagine you've been thinking about these issues for a while since you spent a lot of time in Alaska, where it becomes clear signs of how global warming, climate change is happening. And you were a lawyer, and you mentioned auditing. I imagine that was auditing of companies, and
Hmm.
there's some like kind of regulation aspect to it. What got you into this?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I spent a fair bit of time in Alaska right after I graduated from law school. I hit the road. I think it was
Hmm.
the day after my graduation. I drove north on the Alcan Highway, is what it's called, all the way through Canada and up through
Wow.
That's a
the
long
interior of
drive.
Alaska. It is a long drive. Yeah. I managed to knock it out in like 2.5 days though, because
Oh wow.
I was kind of just that excited about my next step. I had no idea what I was getting into. The Alaskan culture overall is just very unique. Alaskan issues are singular to that state.
Hmm.
And it's kind of one of those things where unless you know, you know, or if you don't know, you don't
Hmm.
know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so the more time I spent in Alaska, I lived 3 solid years in Anchorage before I got the opportunity to
Hmm.
really explore rural Alaska, which is where these issues took on a new reality for me. I think the Alaska conversation about climate change and environmentalism has been going on for a while. For
Hmm.
those not aware, the Exxon Valdez, which was a major oil tanker, spilled in Prince William Sound, Alaska. Think about 20 years ago. I should look
Hmm.
that up, but it
Hmm.
was a
Yeah.
major ecological catastrophe. And um, come to think of it, I think it was longer than 20 years ago. I think it's close to
Hmm.
30 now
I'm
that
finding it
I
for
kind of
it's 1989. Yep.
1989. Okay, not that far off. So yeah, it was awful. And Prince William Sound is, I think, one of my favorite places in Alaska. It's teeming with wildlife today, many years after that spill, but people still talk about it like it was a terrorist attack, like it was
Wow.
an affront to their society. And the
Mm,
the fervor that I noticed amongst people was really, it was harrowing in a
Hmm.
way that I haven't seen a lot of people express about the environment or about climate change. And it struck a chord with me. Alaska politics are very intense. Everybody knows their local politicians. Everybody is
mm,
actively involved. Like it's actually got a pretty high rate of voter turnout per capita.
Hmm.
Um, and so like everybody's talking about local issues, which are Alaska issues all the time. Um,
mhm.
so eventually I got the opportunity after working kind of indirectly for some oil and gas companies and mining companies as well. And that just kind of, it left me feeling weird. I I wasn't stoked about who I was working for or their end goals, but I will say that it was an invaluable training ground for me to really learn the science behind a lot of these issues,
Hmm.
indirectly again from the geologists or geotechnical engineers that I was working with. Got to work with a volcanologist once who studied volcanoes. That was extraordinarily
Wow.
cool. Yeah.
Wow.
Um, but to get back to your original question, Jacob, the first time that I came really close to just awestruck um, entanglement in this issue, I went to Wales, Alaska, Wales.
Hmm.
And if any of your listeners want to check it out on a map, it is the westernmost community in the contiguous North American states or countries.
Wow. Country,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it's
Wow.
way out there. You can actually see Russia from Wales, which is
Whoa.
something that a famous Alaska politician said you could do from all over Alaska, but it's really only true for a
Right.
very limited space. Yeah. Um, and Wales
Wow.
had experienced massive erosion.
Hmm.
And an elder that I got to kind of hang out with a little bit took me to check out a photo taken from a mountain kind of on the outskirts of town of their beach. And this was a beach that I'd spent by that point like about 5 days just kind of traipsing around and checking it out. It was kind of my evening activity. And when he showed me how much of the coastline had changed since that photo was taken, which wasn't that long ago, I forget exactly how many
Mm,
years, it just, my jaw dropped. And from there, I started digging into um, a number of different resources, all of which are publicly available, namely the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who has been tracking a lot of the erosion across Alaska and the lower 48 states. Um,
mm.
the data is horrifying, and
Wow.
when I kind of recall like how different native tribes have approached these issues, like it's tragic. These are homes that
Mm,
generations of individuals have lived in, families, and they've been there for thousands of years, and a lot of them have had to relocate, and it's like
mm.
it's heavy, and I could definitely get emotional talking about it, but
Yeah.
um yeah, so that really opened my eyes. And shortly after that I got involved in nonprofit work, and I
Mm,
worked with the ACLU for a little bit, and the work there was just incredible. And I did some work as well with the Army Corps of Engineers, or sorry, with AmeriCorps,
mm,
liaising with the Army Corps of Engineers at times. But
mhm.
yeah, I kind of pivoted my life, and now I'm with the EPA here in Seattle, and it's been great. I'm really happy that I've been able to align my career with I think I would call these values that I have now
Hmm.
around the environment and
Interesting.
around
Yeah,
climate
yeah.
change. Yeah,
So, a couple follow-up questions.
absolutely.
It was a pivotal moment, the Wales coastline that you saw it, how much it had changed, seeing
Mhm.
from this photo comparison. What specifically had changed?
Yeah, I would say like anywhere from 100 to 120 feet of coastline were no longer there.
It was covered in
Wow.
water.
Yeah, it just the beach was at that time maybe 20 feet long, and the photo, which was close to an aerial photo, there are aerial photos that kind of show this, but It was, as I mentioned, taken from a mountaintop just outside of town, and you could see dozens, if not like over 100 feet of coastline was just gone.
Wow.
Yeah,
And what caused the coastline to disappear?
it was erosion.
Erosion.
Just the
Mm.
just the degradation of the sand and the soil in that area, which was helped by permafrost melting.
Mm.
Which, yeah, to kind of educate anybody not aware, permafrost is permanently frozen ground that is, in some cases, held in place by that ice. When you get freezing aspects, the ice expands and it acts a lot like concrete. And so some building
Mm.
sites up on the north slope of Alaska, the very Arctic coast up there, actually rely heavily on ice and creating ice to maintain oil wells, drilling platforms,
Mm.
and in many cases, villages. And so when the ice starts to melt because of gradually increasing temperatures and longer summers and shorter winters, the ice is not as stable. It will melt, and
Mm.
from there you have um, basically collapse of structures
Wow.
and of landmass. Kind of pivoting a little bit to my last long-term Alaska experience, I spent a year in a village called Port Heiden, and um, Port Heiden was amazing. It was a village of 100 people, and they had lost, I think, about 100 feet of coastline the year before, and they had already had to relocate their village once because the shores were getting closer and closer, and so they moved
Wow.
inland by about a mile. Yeah, and I caught them after that relocation, but it was intense, especially hearing the elders talk about the old village, and tears would come to their eyes when they realized like a lot of their structures were no longer there. I think by the time I got
Wow.
there were like 5 dilapidated old homes at the old village site.
Because they would have to keep
Amazing.
moving homes and
Yeah.
structures back and back
Yeah.
further. Because
Wow.
degradation is just like land becoming softer and falling apart and then going into the ocean.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the tertiary effects of climate change that is really hard to track and attribute to climate change is storm surge and just ever more aggressive hurricanes,
Mm.
and typhoons. Weather patterns have gotten statistically more intense
Mm.
in our era of life, and um, a lot of scientists attribute that to climate change. And I don't know if I'm the person to really walk us through that science, but there's a lot of good
Yeah.
information out there. Yeah.
Right. So what? So you had this draw out of college to head to Alaska. I mean, can we talk a little bit about your story getting up there? Like, what
Yeah, for
pulled you
sure.
to Alaska?
Definitely. Well, going to grad school, my law school experience in Oregon was really neat. I befriended some amazing individuals who, along with being pretty left-leaning, they were very into hiking, camping, rock climbing,
Mm.
and they took me out a bunch. Being kind of an urban kid from LA and then Detroit, and then I went to school in Boston and studied in
Right.
London for a little bit. It was kind of just, the urban concrete mountains were all that I
Right.
knew.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but I think deep in my heart, I had always had a longing. I'm a big fan of Henry David Thoreau and a lot of similar
Mm-hmm.
authors that kind of created this captivation with the wilds and getting
Mm-hmm.
outside and being amongst nature that wasn't really awakened until I got the
Mm.
opportunity to cultivate this community in law school. And
Mm.
I'd say three of my best friends in that circle were all from Alaska. And Alaskans just had
Ah.
this like substance to them. I describe it now as soulfulness. Like Alaskans have a lot of soul. It's really cool to
Right.
see.
Right.
So,
Nice.
yeah, and so the way that they would talk about Alaska and the way that just they came across, and when I met their families when they would pass through, they all had a lot of character, a lot of conviction. And
Mm.
I, having never set foot in Alaska, decided I need to get a job there. I needed to move
Yeah.
there
Got it.
immediately after graduating. Yeah. I was just thrilled by kind of the great unknown, and it is to this day, I think, America's Wild West still. Like there's a lot of
Mm. Totally agree.
lawlessness, unfortunately. Yeah,
Yeah.
but at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity to be had.
Yeah. It's the last frontier still, I think,
Totally,
in
absolutely.
so many ways. I totally agree. Um, So you go up there, you head to Alaska, and you actually start working for oil and gas. Because I'm assuming that's who had jobs at the
Yeah,
time when you
That's the
headed up
economy.
there,
yeah,
right? That was the power of the economy.
absolutely.
But you start bumping into this, you're not feeling great. You said you started working for nonprofits. Can you dig into there a little bit more? Like, what do you mean? How did you meet these
Yeah,
elders that you kind of referenced in that group? Yeah.
for sure. Yeah. So it started with volunteering for the ACLU, and
Okay.
the American Civil Liberties Union is sort of like America's nonprofit law firm. They
Mm,
handle
Huh.
all sorts of stuff. Everything from the recent, not so recent now, but the timely gay marriage legalization at the Supreme Court. That
mm-hmm,
was an ACLU case. Your Miranda
mm,
rights, whenever somebody gets arrested, that came from an
mm-hmm,
ACLU case.
mm,
So basically, the civil rights landscape of America has been cast into stone by the ACLU, and they have been pivotal in any number of civil liberties victories that we as a people have obtained over our generations. And so working with them was like a dream come true. I mean, they are all over my
wow. Yeah.
constitutional law books. Yeah. And,
Nice.
um,
Nice.
and they just kind of needed help. And I'm always willing to lend a hand. And um, I was amongst some very hardcore, passionate activists. And I was like, yes, like I like these people.
Nice.
This is what I'm about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So through
Yeah.
that network, I got hooked up with some opportunities through some nonprofits. I think the best work that I did was with AmeriCorps, who
Mm,
AmeriCorps sort of feeds nonprofits. I was a part of the VISTA program, which is all about increasing capacity for nonprofits throughout America. And that project base was really cool. Helped obtain a lot of grant funding for tribes, but especially a tribal court initiative that allowed for a region of tribes to pool resources to get what's called an intertribal court system going.
hmm.
And that's really important for like juror selection because when you're in a community of 100 people, like chances are jurors know everybody.
Oh,
um,
yeah. Right.
yeah,
Right.
or getting judges from other villages because same kind of problem, conflicts of interest. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, yeah. So it was a fascinating lens to both glimpse kind of like the sociology of a very small community in a legal
Wow.
kind of mindset, but also how do we really maximize, the resources that we have as a collective of communities, and um, that led to some cool experiences, and eventually kind of seeing a lot more of Alaska than I ever thought I would.
Nice.
Yeah.
And so it was a few of these elders. So you're working with one of these villages, and it was one
Hmm.
of these elders who shows you this coastline and this
Yeah.
picture, and it starts to you take even yet another turn. I mean, the environmental turn, right? And you
Yeah.
start going down that path. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. What?
I would say that the elders of any village are by far the most amazing individuals that I've ever met. There's a lot of
Hmm,
deference in the Alaskan Native communities to their elders,
hmm.
but unfortunately, a lot of these elders have lived through some terrible things. I've met an elder that lived through the Spanish flu. That
Wow.
yeah, that knocked out like a full third of the Alaskan Native population.
Sure.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, that
Wow.
village that I mentioned in Wales, I think like two-thirds of their population got knocked out. Like it was some really sad stuff. To say nothing of like the generational trauma of the Russian occupation. I don't think a lot of people realize that the Russians basically like enslaved the Alaska Native population during their time there.
Wow.
It was a brutal occupation.
When was
Yeah, they
that? Wh-
what was that?
When was that?
Oh, that was right before America bought Russia. Um, yeah, Russia was kind of the first colonial era presence in Alaska that was from outside.
Was this
And
1900s? When?
no, this was before that. Let me make sure I'm not giving you any incorrect dates, but the Russian occupation of Alaska, I want to say started in the 1700s.
Okay. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So the Russians started to occupy Alaska. Yeah, I wasn't too far off. 1725 is when that
Okay.
started.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and then America bought it in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
1867.
Wow.
So yeah, it was basically 125 years of Russia just ransacking. They were mostly there for furs, honestly. They didn't really see
Huh.
or
Right.
realize any value in the gold or the platinum or the silver. It was just how much can we get really quickly out of these native tribes? And if there was gold or silver to be had, they definitely took it. But um, the way that I've heard it told, and I've read some histories on this, but I've talked with a lot of folks, is that Russia would come into a community. First thing they would do, they would kill the chief. Second thing they would do is kill like the medicine man or the shaman or whatever kind of holy um, position there was, and sometimes it was a matrilineal line depending on the
Mm,
community and the native tribe in question. So they would kill the medicine woman or their
mm,
equivalent, and basically, that kills the political leadership and then the spiritual leadership. So tribes were
mm.
lost. And as a result, like a lot of language, a lot of their religion,
Oh,
spirituality
wow.
has been just lost in time, unfortunately. And that kind of continued later on. A lot of communities were forced to give up their children for these.
Wow.
I forget what the schools were called, but they were basically unwilling magnet schools that, yeah, like kids were not allowed to speak their native language. They were not allowed to participate in rituals or any parts of their culture that were not white. And a
Mm,
lot of Canadian
wow.
Native communities experienced the same thing. It was brutal. It was tragic,
Wow.
and I think it's kind of a black mark on our country's history. But the
Yeah. Yeah.
Russian dealings were worse. Is
Right. Right.
I can definitely
Oh,
say, yeah,
wow. Wow. So you make this shift. You meet these folks. It sounds like an amazing time, and then you make this shift. And we touched on it a bit, but what is? I mean, just to start from the beginning,
yeah,
Nixon creates this agency, as Jacob pointed out earlier,
yeah,
the EPA.
getting us back.
Yeah, why was it created? Why was the EPA created at the end of the day?
I'm really glad you asked that question. I'm an EPA super nerd. I have been for a while. I
I love
I
it.
I really love this agency and its work, but especially the people. Some of the people that I've met have just been the most brilliant, incredibly passionate humans that I've ever come across in this world. And yeah, there's my big old plug,
Love it.
super
I
nerd
love it.
status. Yeah. So the EPA kind of came to be under President Nixon in 1970 after a series of really awareness spreading events. Unfortunately, two of the three major ones were quite tragic. And but the thing that kicked off the whole show was Rachel Carson, who actually has a boat named after her here that's at University of Washington.
Oh wow.
Yeah, she's quite
Oh
famous,
wow.
really cool lady. She published in 1962 a book about pesticides and about the long-term effects that pesticides have on life. Um, she was a bird watcher back then,
Hmm.
and she was noticing
Oh.
how birds that were hanging out around crops that had heavy use of pesticides were dying.
Mm.
And so the name of that book was called Silent
Hmm.
Spring. And the silent part of that is that the forests that were kind of around these crops were becoming silent. There was no more bird song to be had.
Wow.
Right.
And
Wow.
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
that book was a big jump off in the American public's awareness of environmental issues and especially our impacts on the environment. And
Hmm.
the other two instances were just pretty sad and shocking, I think. But one actually happened down in California, Ty, where you and I have our points of origin. There was a major tanker that spilled.
Mm.
Pretty sure it was near LA. Um, and that created kind of a widespread concern for, oh God, like a spill could happen anywhere. This could be in our
Right.
backyard.
Sure.
Um, and then something even more explosive, I think, which really kicked off a widespread campaign of the American public, but especially the media, towards cleaning up our environmental resources, was that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio in
Mm.
1969 was so polluted that it caught on fire. Like literally spontaneously
Oh.
combusted
And it was a huge
Wow.
miles
fire.
of river. Yeah, it was insane. Um,
Wow.
and it basically brought like a lot of the Great Lakes, which was a major commerce center for the US at
Sure.
that time,
Sure.
brought it to a standstill. The
Oh.
fires and the smoke from the fires had tremendous impacts in
Wow.
that entire region. So that happened in 1969. A year later, actually not even a year, I think it was like 6 months later, Richard Nixon signed the EPA into law as an executive agency, which basically means it's under the power of the executive, the presidential branch. And
Interesting.
over the course, we just celebrated 50 years actually, not too
Wow.
long ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
and over the course of that time, it's really spread out to a lot of different directions. The EPA has an amazing suite of offerings that I think it provides to the American public, and I'm just real happy to be aboard.
Yeah, that's great. So when it was formed, was there like a charter? Was it this? I mean, because the disasters that you brought up are big, and so was there a direction, a philosophy that kind of the EPA like launched under when it just kicked off, or was it like go figure this out kind of a thing?
Yeah. Um, so it was, I believe, under an executive reorganization, which is a fancy way of saying we're going to shuffle things up a bit. And
Hmm.
yeah, he had a proposal put forth that kind of merged pollution control, which had been proposed
Mm.
by Congress earlier, but this kind of brought it under one roof, along with a combination of pesticides programs, um,
Oh,
and just kind of general like oversight into water quality and elements of like the
ah,
public health service. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so 50 years in, has the philosophy, focus, direction of the EPA changed at all?
I think so. Yeah. I would say that, from what I've heard and what I've researched, I wasn't around in the 1970s, but it sounds like the focus of the EPA was a lot more on monitoring and enforcing environmental laws. It was sort of
Mm,
a watchdog slash like the policeman of the environment. And
got it.
today, while that is still a significant element of what the EPA does, there is also a huge amount of the EPA funding that goes towards grants. And grant making is actually, I'd say, one of the
Hmm,
bigger functions of the EPA today. Um,
interesting.
yeah, so
Grants for what?
yeah, I'm so excited you asked that. Yeah. Grants for all sorts of stuff, but anything environmental related that you can think of, the EPA probably has a grant for it. Anything from education grants, which I think are probably our most effective because education
Hmm,
grants are all about spreading awareness in our schools and in um, after hours education
hmm,
programs, all about the environment and what you can do on a small scale, but eventually small scales become big scales to
hmm,
help the human health and the environment, which is incredible. But that's to say nothing of the small governments that are funded. So we're talking like municipalities,
hmm,
counties throughout the United States that are funded to have everything from conservation to environmental cleanups. Um,
interesting.
yeah, along with nonprofits, nonprofits are funded by EPA grants that allow them to take on any number of initiatives in a lot of different directions, recycling, composting, like in renewable energy. There's just a lot of breadth to what the EPA now funds, and I think part of that model of sort of we're now delegating the environmental work. I think it's
Hmm.
been a tremendous success, and it's great to see how it's evolved into empowering the American people to act on these very critical issues that our country is facing.
Are these some of the grants that come into cities and some communities to like make homes more environmentally friendly, like put a double pane window in and you'll get rebates or things like this that'll be are those EPA driven or some of those at the very least?
Absolutely, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's some really cool work out there that I think a lot of states are taking advantage of as well. Um,
Nice.
and interestingly enough, there was a fun article that dropped just today. So October
Oh
20th
wow.
is when we're recording this, and there's a fun I think component of the EPA that, along with funding local initiatives and helping enable states and communities and municipalities towards their environmental goals, Another thing that the EPA will do, kind of more on the watchdog end of things, is really calling people out. And the EPA recently called out what they're coining environmental racism in Louisiana's Cancer Alley. And so to kind of
Wow.
educate our listeners, there is an area in southeastern Louisiana that has a disproportionate cancer risk from industrial air pollution.
Wow.
Um, yeah, the agency found that children in one predominantly black elementary school have been exposed to dangerous carcinogenic levels at 11 times what the EPA considers
Oh,
acceptable.
wow.
Yeah. So the EPA took to task and wrote a letter to Louisiana's environmental and health agencies to basically analyze the cumulative impacts for residents and just kind of make it known what's been going on.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's a very unique component to what the EPA does. It spreads awareness. We've got a lot of data,
Interesting.
and I think that,
Yeah.
making sure that we are amplifying that data in the right way is something that's very cool. And I'm not sure would have happened maybe under the prior administration, but as we kind of lean into this new day and age of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has been a long time coming, it's great to see that such a powerful agency is taking a stand against, what might be considered institutional racism.
Interesting. And from a environmental though lens, like it was
Absolutely.
super interesting perspective
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So as you know, Jason, one of the things we've been doing this season is talking to for-profit companies that are doing something
Yeah.
for the environment. And to be, frank, like some of our guests have been doing some huge globally impacting things, and I know you don't know all of them yet, but you will. And so one of the things that we wanted to explore with you was this idea of like, where does the EPA play and where should they play in this realm with small businesses, startups, entrepreneurs? When should they get involved and when shouldn't they be involved? And how is it the best to think of them in that frame?
Yeah. Oh man, that's such a fun area of conversation. And big shout out to all your guests that have come on. I have such tremendous respect for people that are in the private sector that are thinking about these things. And I agree with the premise of your show is that climate change and environmentalism um, can have no greater proponent and no greater impactful advocacy than in the for-profit sector.
Hmm.
Um, and so to that end, I'm of the belief that much like profitability, sustainability is won on the margins. I think that
Mm.
anybody who's been in a for-profit space is always watching their margins. What are we spending, our nickels and dimes on? And
Hmm.
similarly, environmentalism and the fight for sustainability um, happens in incremental small changes. And
Hmm.
so, if you look at successful implementation of things like solar installs for buildings or facilities, um,
Hmm.
electric fleet adaptations, if a company has a lot of vehicles, or just making changes to your facilities' energy efficiency. These are things that are environmentally sound and safe and happy,
Hmm.
and the EPA likes that. I like that. But in the long run, they actually support profitability margins as well. So where we see that Venn diagram of intersection between sound environmental business and profitable, decisions for a company, I think that there's a lot of overlap. And I'm excited that conversations like these are happening because it gets me really excited. It gives me hope. Um, right now we're recording. I think all three of us are in the Seattle area, and
Hmm.
my throat's a little bit raw. I've had a slight headache this week because we've had some of the worst wildfires and some of the
Right.
worst air
Right.
quality over the past 6 weeks than Seattle's ever seen. And the past several
Yeah.
summers, actually, it's been bad for like a month or more.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
so we're kind of seeing like the hardcore impacts. I got my experiences in Alaska witnessing how climate change is literally changing the landscape. Um, but I think that we're all now bearing witness to a, a changing Earth that if
Mm.
we're not careful, we can quickly get overwhelmed by all the bad news out there.
Hmm.
So it's a true honor to be on a show that is highlighting the good work that's being done and the fascinating and really out of the box ideas that folks are
Sure.
generating, especially in our capitalistic economy. It's powerful stuff.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, really appreciate you bringing that to light and your perspective in that I think you support our thesis of this podcast this year, and I appreciate that. But I don't want to. We can't negate the fact that sometimes, especially the headlines,
Mm,
will paint the EPA with a certain brush. Right. And
for sure.
they definitely, I mean, you said it yourself. There's a watchdog arm of the EPA that is there to call things out, and it will be positioned, it has been positioned, you read about it being positioned as anti-business, stopping commerce in certain realms. How should we think of that, about that? How do you respond to that? And is that right? Or is
Mm,
there another way to think? Is there another side to that story?
yeah. Well, I think anytime you get anything that's kind of potentially seen as risking profitability in the private space, and that's going to cause alarm. And I do think
Hmm.
that there's been a lot of sensationalization of
Hmm.
various EPA standards or what the EPA wants to do, not
Hmm.
necessarily what it has done or what it will do, but what it really wants to get after. And that's to be understood. I think that a lot of
Hmm.
people, perhaps with short-term goals of how do we maximize our money and
Hmm.
and that kind of thing that kind of thinking is dangerous in my opinion. But I
Hmm.
very much understand why the EPA would be seen as the bad guy in that space. And um, some people believe that the EPA will take an inch of legislation and run a mile with it.
Hmm.
And there's a lot to be said for the interpretation of scientific standards and data.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so it really does depend on the political regime in place. The prior
Interesting.
administration had a very different view on where the EPA could go with the laws that are in place.
Hmm.
Our current administration is, marching to the beat of a different drum, and so has really empowered the EPA to um, take initiative in some ways and
Hmm.
open the doors for broader enforcement. So, um, as I mentioned before, when Nixon founded the EPA, it was under the executive branch. So no
Hmm.
matter what happens, everything that the EPA does is in some way directed by whoever is in the office of the presidency.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
There was I saw this. There's a news segment. They had more of a conservative lean. It was about Pebble Mine.
Mm.
I couldn't tell if it was a city or if it was like that was actually the name of the mine, but it
Yeah,
was that.
it's the name of a mine in Alaska,
Okay, and it was
and not even a real mine, but like a potential mine. It's not happened yet.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It was a company that was preparing to create this mine and source natural resources out of it. I wasn't sure if it was gold, silver, or other things. And
All of the
then
above.
all the above. And
Hmm.
then uh, at the
Wow.
last minute before they got approved, the EPA said we're shutting this down. And
Yeah.
the city nearby, the village nearby was there's a lot of people upset about it because it was going to create a lot of jobs. It was going
Mm-hmm.
to drive some tourism,
Hmm.
hotels, hospitality, all of that, and even the local population. So they interviewed some of the local population. They were pretty jazzed about like this is so unfair, right? And then they even interviewed someone from the EPA who had to very judiciously or diplomatically be not hand wavy, emotional, be like, we're trying our best, and this is just a decision that we went with. It was really interesting. I guess this ties nicely into the next question, which is Jason. So from your perspective, who is the EPA's audience currently? If and it's since the EPA has gone through a lot of changes in the past 50 years, and before it was more of a watchdog, kind of a maintenance to get to a baseline of environmental human relationship. Who is the EPA's audience now?
That is a fascinating question. Um, Yeah, so the mission of the EPA is to safeguard the human health and the environment. That's kind of the quick takeaway
Hmm.
from the mission statement. Human
Yeah.
health and the environment. So I would say that the key demographic, if you wanted to put it that way, um, but Jacob, I think audience is a great term for it, is anybody that cares about human health and the environment on a micro level, on a macro level. Um, there's a lot that can be done in a granular sense to help human health and the environment in your community. Um, but if you want to start getting involved at a bigger level, I think the EPA is a fun touchstone for that. Not only to keep
Hmm.
you informed and aware, the EPA has a great Twitter presence, I think.
Hmm.
It's got some great social media pages if you're on Instagram or whatever, to just keeping you appraised. I think the first step in the environmental fight is just to spread awareness and to create passion. I think
Hmm.
that the more young people, especially, that are galvanized and excited by this work that we have in America, I think the better our future is going to be.
Hmm.
And one of the cool things about the EPA right now is that it is poised to basically double in size over the next several years. We've gotten a
Hmm.
lot of funding from the infrastructure bill. Um, Recently the IRA bill was put forth. The IRA stands for Inflation Reduction Act, and I think the Build Back Better bill also has a fair chunk of spending for the EPA.
Hmm.
Um, but
That was
this is
the
all,
infrastructure. Was that the infrastructure bill that was
yeah,
passed earlier in the year? Yeah.
yeah. Which is all to say that the EPA right now is poised to do a lot of hiring, kick out a lot more grants, which is super
Hmm.
exciting. But it also, I think, comes with an ask, and that is that we need to replenish our ranks. Under the prior administration, there's a lot of frustration, I think, with not really being able to continue work or not being able to represent work in ways that a lot of people thought um, held true to this term scientific integrity. And scientific
Hmm.
integrity is kind of a loaded term, but I think it's actually not. I think it just means, what does the data show you and how should you act according to
Interesting.
logic
Yeah.
and rationale that informs our scientific principles. And unfortunately, a lot of EPA staff just decided that it was not an environment where it was not an organization
Hmm.
that they
Hmm.
could really see themselves staying with. And a lot of us still mourn that time and
Well,
the people and the passion that we lost. So there's a new generation that is coming into the EPA, and I think that we're just now seeing kind of the beginning of how effective a new and galvanized workforce can be in this space. So yeah, that's kind of my
wow.
quick little
Nice.
spiel about it.
Well,
Yeah.
wow.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so you said the audience is anyone who cares about human health and environment.
Mhm.
And you talked about these grants. These grants go in an educational way through programs. I imagine it's maybe some scholarships too. Then you mentioned nonprofits. Do these grants go to businesses at all,
They
for-profit
do.
companies? They do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, if we take a moment to examine the most recent bit of funding, the Inflation Reduction Act, um, which I believe gave about $41 billion in appropriated funding over the course of many
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
Yeah. And a number of those appropriated funds will go towards for-profit sector things, such as I think there's about $3 billion in grants to reduce air pollution at ports. Ports are
Wow.
a very, vital part of our commerce in this country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And part of that funding is going towards installing zero emission technology to develop climate action plans for ports.
Interesting.
Mm.
Yeah. Additionally, there's about $1.5 billion going towards methane emission reductions,
Hmm.
um, which will provide grants and technical assistance to accelerate emissions reductions from petroleum and natural gas systems. And that's
Hmm.
a big part of our energy cycle in this country.
Interesting.
So you mentioned ports, methane, reducing methane. Are
Mhm.
spin-off question, are there already the technologies in place to reduce methane that emissions and help those ports out, or is there going to be is there also funding available to research and development or universities to develop that from the EPA?
You know, I'm not 100% sure, so don't quote me on this,
Okay.
but I'm pretty sure that there are methane scrubbers that our air quality
Oh,
teams advocate. Yeah, and
yeah,
but
yeah.
another fun part of our EPA work that I haven't even mentioned yet, which is super exciting, is that there's a lot of R&D that goes on behind the scenes here into
Oh,
climate
interesting.
change and just ecological technologies. The EPA holds a number of patents. I don't
Wow.
know how many, but it
Wow.
does hold some patents on very, very cool, not only like environmental sensors, like a number of our air quality indicators, I think, were developed here in the EPA.
Huh.
Yeah, and so
Didn't
yeah, so
realize.
there's a lot of cool stuff that we R&D here in house. I have nothing to do with any of it, and I'm woefully ill-informed, but I will say that's something we do.
Nice.
We gotta hear more about this though. Like I'm glad we have you on the show. I'm a marketer by heart. I mean, the reason I asked you that question, I framed it like that, is because I'm always asking who is our audience, whatever
Mm,
company I'm working at, or if
mhm.
I'm helping someone out, who's your audience, and putting myself and everyone else in their shoes so we really meet the need or like hit the chord. Right.
Yeah,
So that the amplification of what the EPA is doing, it's easy to go to the website and go, this is a dictionary. Oh, where do
it's
I
huge.
start? Do I start at A? Do I start at Z? Right? Or do I
Yeah,
start
yeah.
at K? Right?
Yeah.
So this is super cool. I guess changing gears a little bit.
Mhm.
You mentioned in casual conversation you've seen some unexpectedly good things coming
Yeah.
organically in nature through what's happened through climate change. We often talk about the unfortunate, sad things like loss of animal population,
Mhm.
melting of glaciers, and so forth. It sounds like you've seen some good stuff, huh?
I've seen some weird stuff. Yeah.
Weird stuff. Yeah. What's up with that?
Yeah. So I guess building on the permafrost segue of earlier, and I'm really glad you brought this up because this is one of the wilder scenarios that I've heard of and seen in real life is that as the permafrost starts to melt up in northern Alaska, the foliage, the botanical trees and shrubs and whatnot that are
Hmm.
able to grow are going further and further north. Their seeds are taking
Hmm.
hold in soil that has up until now been frozen and can't support root systems. So,
Ah,
along with this being a really cool way to combat erosion, because a root system is a great way, much like ice, to
right.
keep that soil all together, um,
Sure.
we've been seeing, and I've personally seen, moose populations venturing further and further northward. And this is exciting for two reasons. First off, moose is delicious. um, I hope I don't offend any of your listeners that are vegetarians. I don't eat very much meat, but when a friend has gotten a delicious moose, I will not say no.
Wow. Well,
Yeah,
all right. All right.
yeah. So it's helping moose populations, which have been, threatened in the past, but also it's providing a food source for polar bears who have previously not
Oh,
seen moose. As the moose
interesting.
population goes more northward and towards the sea,
Yeah.
the polar bear population, which is running out of sea ice and thus can't eat or hunt seals like they used to, these two populations are intersecting, and we're seeing a
Huh.
food source for polar bears, and in a way like I don't think most scientists really realized. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, so these points of intersection are few and far between right now, but if these projections continue in the way that, and this is all hearsay, I can't
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
quote any sources right now, but I have talked to a number of scientists, biologists, and ecologists who believe that, by the end of our lifetimes, these two organisms might actually be fully interacting and become, the polar bear's primary food source, which, holy
Wow.
cow, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Wild.
yeah.
Totally
Um,
wild.
So
And
in it's
similarly, yeah, in like another vein, like in a sort of like love finds a way vein,
Yeah.
there have been documented cases of polar bears and grizzly bears mating and creating strawberry bears.
Wow.
Yeah, like
Wild.
nature just doing its thing.
Doing its thing. It always
Yeah,
finds a way. Like you said, love always finds a way.
it
I like
does. Yeah,
that. I've always heard life always finds a way. I like that one even better.
yeah.
That's
It's
great.
it's all love, you know. Just get a polar
Exactly.
bear and a grizzly bear together. If they're lonely, things might
You
happen.
never know.
so in a cage match between a bear, a polar bear, and a moose, the polar bear will win.
Oh yeah, polar bear are massive. They're the biggest
Really?
bears on Earth.
Wow.
Yeah, they're
Because
so
I thought
right behind
mooses
them.
were huge.
Oh yeah, moose are massive too, but man, a full-grown polar bear, like those are like gargantuan
Wow.
beings.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
An alpha
I'm gonna
animal.
do a, another bit. I saw a polar bear um stuffed once that I want to say was like 11 feet
Oh
Oh
my
my
god.
goodness.
tall. Yeah, when it stood up. Um,
Wow.
and I think that might have been okay. Yeah, they've been known to reach more than 10 feet tall. So I think one of the ones I saw was like a record-setting
Right,
bear
right,
that
right.
just yeah, it was like blowing my mind with how big it was. But yeah, that's about
Wow.
1,500 pounds worth of bear.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and
That's massive.
yeah. Oh, and I guess yep, they've documented polar bears that are 13 feet tall on their hind legs.
Wow.
So yeah, like that'll take out a moose for sure. It's just a
For
matter of
sure.
can they get close enough because moose can definitely run faster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not.
Luckily they've got camouflage, so
There you go.
yeah.
Not for long.
Yeah, right.
I love it. Well, man, you've definitely, covered the gamut when it comes to this environmental journey. One of the things that we like to ask, for, other entrepreneurs a lot of times, but I think in your mind, your experience, like from all the things you've seen, from the different, places that you've been, people you've consulted with and worked with, if someone were to go into this space and wanted to do an earth-serving consultancy business focused direction, what is some advice, tips and tricks, pitfalls, whatever that you could potentially, pass on to a group of like unlikely or likely entrepreneurs or people who want to get into this space?
Yeah. Well, number one, I think that if they don't have experience in at least something adjacent to this space, or maybe in this space directly, to immediately team with somebody who has. The environmental world, especially on a consultancy or a for-profit level, is actually pretty small, and you're going to run into
Hmm.
a lot of the same people. They are big personalities usually, and they hold court and sort of have an orbit over a lot
Hmm.
of influence and a lot of
Hmm.
institutional knowledge that excuse me, I'm going to blame these wildfires.
It's all right. Yeah, we're all feeling it.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say ally and team yourself with people that have done work in this space or are adjacent to this space,
Nice.
because you really don't know what you don't know,
Yeah.
and it can be a hard niche to carve out. Um, but ideally, if you are interested in getting something going, there are a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of playbooks that are
Hmm.
publicly
Hmm.
available. There's a lot of grant funding from the EPA and other sources. And so really just kind of educating yourself. That would
Yeah.
probably be my second big point is just commit yourself to a lot of autodidactic education. You got to be
Hmm.
able to self-teach. And
Yeah.
and that's something I encourage kind of anybody coming up in their career is just learn how to research, research, research. There's so much on the internet, it can be overwhelming. So really just learning how to triangulate your searches to find resources that are going to be of the most value to you. That's a pretty core skill set. So I would say between those two, one is sort of externalized, getting your getting your people, getting your team, and the second
Hmm.
very internalized is getting your
Hmm.
knowledge and getting your research down. And don't be afraid to focus. Don't be afraid to really drill down and get granular with your mission. If there's something about
Interesting.
climate
Yeah.
change or environmentalism that really gets you going, be it composting, be it electric cars, be it solar, whatever is your like singular focus, make that your thing and just, put your
Hmm.
stamp out there as like, this is what we do, and develop that specialization and just don't let up. Um, I think anybody that has started a new venture or a small business can tell you like you're gonna get knocked down. And
Hmm.
I come from a family of small business owners and entrepreneurs,
Hmm.
and they really taught me a lot about resiliency and being able to just, you know, pick yourself up and dust off when the knocks come, because it's gonna
Love
happen.
it.
You're gonna get a lot of
Yeah.
frustration, but the wins that you find at the end of that, it's so worth it.
Nice.
Yeah,
That
and that's how I think I felt at the beginning of my nonprofit and
Really.
my kind of
Yeah.
outreach journey. Yeah, it was really hard. There's a lot of rejection out there, and there's a lot of um, frustration, especially when I was applying for grants on behalf of tribes and stuff.
Hmm.
I got told no way more often than I got
Wow.
told yes, but the wins were all the sweeter because of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I helped some
Great.
tribes obtain like millions of dollars in grant funding, and it,
Wow.
it feels really good to say that, but at the time I couldn't have fathomed winning like a $5,000 grant. So,
Wow.
you just really
Heck
have
of a
to,
journey.
yeah, you just have to maintain your wherewithal and try to stay focused on the why of what you're
Love
doing.
it.
I
Yeah.
I think that's some great advice. So you mentioned ally with people in the space.
Hmm.
How do you find them? Like, say I'm working in tech in Seattle or San Francisco. How do I go about finding them?
Yeah, I would say email is actually your greatest tool. There's a lot
Okay.
of people that will just respond to random emails if you can strike the right chord. Um, if you can find a LinkedIn profile that fascinates you, somebody that's been
Hmm.
doing random stuff in a space that you think is cool, don't be afraid. Um,
Love it.
I, I think a lot of people of my generation and younger generations are pretty scared of being awkward, or they get social anxiety. I definitely get that. But yeah, just like get tanked on some caffeine, find your favorite coffee, and just go ham
Go
on
for
sending.
it.
Yeah, just send a lot of messages. There's nothing to be
Love
lost
it.
from trying, you know?
Right? Oh
Yeah.
yeah. That's great advice. That's great advice.
And I guess a little bit of practice and wordsmithing, being able to kind
That
of like
helps.
get making something land, right?
Yeah,
Could be
yeah.
really helpful too. And
And
trial and
never,
error too.
yeah, and never underestimate flattery. If you've researched somebody and you bring up
Love it.
things about them that you've read online that you really like or that like get you excited, say it. I don't think
Yep.
that there's anything wrong with, pumping somebody up or letting them know, be it a loved one, be it a colleague, or be it a potential, networking opportunity. Let them know what you like about them. I
Hmm.
think
Love
that
it.
there's so much to be
Be
said
real.
for like
Yeah.
just amping the positivity. Yeah. Don't hold
Yeah.
back.
I actually think
Like it.
there is a lot of truth to the well framed researched email, and
Mm.
I've listened to a lot of interviews with people from a lot of different industries. Like there was a guy who wanted to work with a Michelin star chef,
Mm.
and he was like, I found him by sending an email because I was so passionate about the cooking that he was doing, and I was like, man, I would love to read that email, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's because he just used his fervor of passion to communicate it through the email, and it landed. And the guy said, you should come over to this small town in France, and I'll talk to me, right? And he's like, okay, gotta change his life, right? Little things
Wow.
like that can really have an impact.
Oh,
An
I
email,
love
starting
that.
with an email.
Yeah.
Jason, we're gonna wrap up here. What we're gonna do something called rapid mayhem questions. So
Cool.
we're gonna enter
There
the
we go.
chamber of trying to go fast, but it's okay if we
Okay.
don't. All right.
Yeah.
So first off, true or false? From 1970 to 2015, total U.S. emissions of six common pollutants at that time dropped by 35% on average, while GDP grew by 246%. True or false?
Oh, I'm gonna I'm gonna go ahead and say false, just because I think emissions probably dropped, or probably increase during that time as opposed to decrease. But I'm a pessimist in that regard.
Okay. They didn't call it specifically the common pollutants, but it actually was false. It was even bigger.
Yeah.
It was 70% drop on
Oh,
average of
really?
these 6 common pollutants. Yeah, I'll send you a link to the source. So we'll share with the audience too.
Cool. Okay.
But that was pretty cool. In that 45-year period, maybe of some of these things you mentioned in terms of pesticides, pollutants into the water that are pretty common. Lead, for example, just kind of some of the ones out the top of my head. All right, next one, true or false? So that work that reduced 6 common pollutants by 70% led to 86,000 emergency room visits that didn't happen, and 13 million lost job days from work that did happen because.
Oh, wow. I'll go ahead and say true, because that sounds like, there would be a logical
Yeah,
improvement in human health from environmental improvement like that.
sure.
You're right. You are right. You're right.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
I love
Shot
it.
in the
Oh,
dark.
look at that. All right.
True and false is always so
two right.
nice. You're
I know,
right
yeah.
50% of the time
Hey, but so far you're 100%. You're doing it. I like it.
for all
All
the
right,
wrong
so
reasons.
I'm glad you mentioned Cancer Alley earlier because it's this next question. So true or false?
Wow.
Cancer Alley is an 85-mile stretch of land along the Mississippi River with 150 petrochemical plants. This is the part, true or false? It accounts for 25% of the nation's petrochemical production.
Wow. That's a big chunk.
Quarter. Yeah.
Yeah. See, I know about Cancer Alley only due to like as I mentioned before, like the disproportionate amount of health stuff going on there. But 25%, that sounds very large. I'm gonna go ahead and say false.
Okay. It is true.
No way.
It is true.
Oh,
As
man.
of 20
85-mile stretch
16.
of land. Wow. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
That's huge.
150
No wonder it's
petrochemical
such a
plants.
problem. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a
Well, I
big
mean,
piece
when you
of
think
land.
about all the oil refineries there, like that's where I'm sure we
Yeah.
get a lot of our plastics, a lot of our gasoline.
Ah,
Yeah.
brutal.
Yeah.
Wow.
Damn.
Yeah. But it makes that now I get why it's called Cancer Alley, man. Jeez, that's I would have thought that was false too.
Yeah. Wow.
All right, last one, true or false? Bringing it full circle, or I could say full Earth. Global Earth temperature, as measured as an annual average anomaly, was most recently measured at 0.5 degrees of warming, like as of 2022 Celsius. True or false?
Oh, I think that's false.
What do you think it is?
I recently heard a climate change scientist, I think, put it at closer to like 2 point something.
Ooh.
Am I way off?
It's a little high.
Okay.
The source that I use was actually I think it was NASA. Yep, it was the climate arm of NASA. They claim it's at just under 1 degree Celsius of warming as of 2022, but it's been going up since 1970.
Okay. I might have heard a
But
projection.
it's still false. He still got it right.
Yeah, right.
You're right.
For
Hey,
reasons.
that's
Still
true.
got it right. Still got it
Okay.
right.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. No, I might have heard a projection.
Yeah, sure,
projection
something.
out.
I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I think
it's
you're
hard
right.
to sometimes separate the data that you hear from like
Right.
what people think the data will be
Yeah.
in the future.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because I
Love it.
actually looked this up 2 weeks ago, and I
Mhm.
found something, and it said 1.6 degrees at that moment, and I was like, oh, it's 1.6. Okay. And I started sharing that fact with people, and then now I'm like, God, I just lied to people for the past 2 or 3 weeks about how much warmer the Earth got. I just feel like it's that thing that people throw around. They're like, oh, we got to keep it from getting to 2 degrees. It's like, okay, what's the baseline? What's that reference?
Yeah,
And what's
yeah,
your
yeah,
source?
yeah.
Let's like really get down to that first, right? Okay. Well, Rapid Mayhem questions have now been closed. The chamber
Nice job.
has been locked.
Nice
So,
job.
Thanks, guys.
You did
That was
good. You
awesome.
did good.
It's
Go
real
on,
fun.
Jason.
Great.
all right. Lastly, climate change. It's pretty big, right? People often feel helpless in helping, and that's often why they don't do anything. What's the equivalent of what a listener can do? What do you think? What can anyone do?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's overwhelming. And when you take a look at the media and kind of all the bad news that is out there, or just the smoke in our skies right now, it can feel like a lot.
Yeah.
Um, I would say to the average listener, to the average individual, just start small. It doesn't have to be a huge shift. It can be incremental. The EPA is one of the first workspaces to have composting in most of their
Wow.
buildings. I think composting is a great first step.
There you go.
As is recycling. Like we've got our trash bins, which we try not to use as much as possible. Then we've got our recycling
Right.
bins, which we use a little bit more. And then lastly, our composting bins, which ideally we're composting most of our waste. So I'd say first think about your waste. That's
Nice.
probably a good place to start. But at the end of the day, just stay mindful of your thoughts. I think I encourage a lot of the athletes that I coach on the water to engage in a meditation practice and just be aware of what you're thinking and why you're thinking it. And if you do find yourself overwhelmed, sit down, pause, and try to find a good news story. Try to find something in your life that heartens you or somebody in your life that lifts you up.
Nice.
Yeah.
Chasen, amazing journey. Really thank you on giving us such a perspective on the EPA and the role that it's playing today and how we might, as business folks here in our business mind, leverage it and use it and work with it, which I think that is super powerful. Where can we find you today? How do we find the things that you're interested in online?
Thank you, Ty. Yeah, and thank you, Jacob. This has been a true honor. I love these sorts of exchanges. Well, I've got a really old website. If you're interested about my Alaska journeys, it's
Drop
not
it.
Love it.
updated, and I needed to probably update that, but it's called alaskavillagetovillage.com. And just a
Nice.
random little snapshot into some of my journeys. And if you want to find me on social media, I am on Instagram at Seattle Rowing Coach, all one word, no underscores. And you can check out some cool rowing photography. And sometimes I'll talk a little bit about nature and stuff. And there's a
Love
lot
it.
of wildlife around Lake Union and Lake Washington that I like to photograph too.
No
Yeah.
dashes, just Seattle Rowing Coach.
Yep. And no
Love it.
dashes either in the blog, just alaskavillagetovillage.com.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Love it.
And thank you guys. I really appreciate
Yeah.
the work that you're doing. I think it is so cool that this podcast is about to pop, and I can't wait to
Yeah.
listen.
Thanks for nerding out with us, man. This is
Yeah, totally.
you got me
Anytime.
nerding out on the EPA.
Sweet. And I'm gonna try to hook you guys up with somebody that might know a little bit more about like the nitty-gritty of what we do. I know some people that I think would be really jazzed to speak with you. So maybe like another EPA segment would have somebody
That'd be
that's a little
sweet.
bit better informed. Yeah.
Wow, that'd be great. We really appreciate that. But this one's been awesome.
Yeah, it really
And
has.
we learned a lot. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Chasen.
Thank you, fellas. Have
Thanks,
a good one.
Chasen. See you later, man. Bye.
Boom. How was that? Well, there's more. So keep listening. We speak with climate tech leaders and change makers in EV, reforestation, solar energy, flood mapping, and a whole lot more. Also, you can give feedback or check out show notes at our website, climatemayhem.com. Thanks for listening and see you next time.
Oh, don't forget, if you found this valuable or interesting at all, please hit subscribe. That way we know you're loving it. So just go to Spotify or whatever podcast app you're on, hit that subscribe button at the top. Production was done by Daniel Steenkamp with cover art by Harrison Glenn. This is Jacob Kubica with my legendary colleague, Ty Wolf motherfucking Jones. Peace out, Climate Mayhem. Out.